Okay, so we're back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at something that I think a lot of people find pretty tricky.
Yeah.
And that is cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation.
Yeah.
And as always, we like to go in depth with just one source.
Right.
And this is going to be from a YouTube video.
Okay.
And the YouTube video is titled, Dear White Liberal, Stop Being Offended.
Okay.
And this is by a YouTuber named Aquarius Wave.
All right.
And I think this is going to be a really fascinating one to unpack because there's a lot in this video.
Yeah, I'm sure. And this is one of those topics that it's really important to be able to see both sides, I think. And also to understand, you know, who this person is speaking to as well.
Yeah.
Because that's going to help us understand the arguments that they're making.
Absolutely. And so the first thing I want to jump into is he opens up the video talking about a guy wearing traditional Chinese clothing.
Right.
And he talks about how the reactions were split, where the non-Chinese college students were offended, while the older Chinese women were actually delighted to see their culture represented.
It's so interesting, right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting contrast. And so this is where this ideal comes into play of like, is wearing another culture's clothing inherently disrespectful?
Yeah. And that's such a great question to ask yourself before even diving into this video. What do you think?
Yeah.
Is that inherently a disrespectful thing?
And he seems to think that, you know, these college students were basically assuming offense for the Chinese people.
Right.
And that actually can be detrimental to those people, to their growth.
Yeah, I think one of the arguments that he's making is that by taking offense for someone, you're essentially like babying them.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so he uses this language of, you know, you're cuddling them and you're coddling them.
Yeah.
And that actually can stifle their growth.
Right.
And he's saying that it can stifle their emotional, their mental, and even their physical growth, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But he says, you know, these safe spaces keep you in a state of perpetual adolescence. So it's a pretty strong take, but you know, it's an interesting point, I think.
It is. And then he goes on to talk about something else that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
Which is the Washington Redskins football team.
Okay.
And as you know, there was a lot of controversy around the name.
Yeah.
And they ended up changing the name because it was considered offensive.
Right.
But the logo was originally designed by a Native American man.
Wow.
And then his family petitioned to have the name reinstated.
Oh, wow.
So it just goes to show how complex these issues can be.
Absolutely.
And that, you know, one person's offense can be another person's pride.
Yeah, you can't assume
Right.
to know how a whole group of people are going to feel about something like that.
Right. And so his whole thing is about this idea that, you know, when you take offense for other people,
right,
you're essentially...
They're not helping them.
You are hindering their ability to develop their own inner character and level of resolve.
Yeah, and he even uses this language that you're creating adult children that are stuck in a perpetuated state of adolescence.
Yes, and that was...
strong words.
What really got me thinking.
Yeah.
Like, okay, what does he mean by that?
What do you think about that? What are your initial reactions to that?
Well, I think there are some valid points in there.
Yeah.
Right? Like, resilience is important. And being able to, you know, sort of take the slings and arrows of life is really important for growing and becoming a mature person.
Right. But is it that simple?
But I do think that there's also, you have to acknowledge that not everybody's starting from the same place.
Right.
And that there are power imbalances at play.
Totally.
And historical context that we can't just ignore.
So to illustrate this point about personal growth, he brings up an example of a Halloween costume that he saw. Okay. And it was a woman dressed as baby oil.
And her partner dressed, as he said, P. Diddy blackface.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's definitely...
He said that he doesn't care, but in the past he would have been very offended by this.
Yeah.
And he also brought up the movie White Chicks.
Okay.
Which he said probably wouldn't be made today.
Right.
Because things have changed.
Interesting.
So he's saying, like, what's changed? Is it personal growth?
Yeah.
Or is it society changing?
That is the question, right? Yeah. Like, what is it that's changed there?
And then he goes on to use this very provocative analogy of affirmative action relationship.
Affirmative action relationship.
So he's saying that, like, when you push for certain relationship dynamics, that's actually detrimental and you should have to qualify for a relationship.
So he's comparing it to, like, demanding a job just for showing up?
Yeah, he's saying, like, you know, are you going to be an asset or a liability?
Right.
Well, that doesn't matter because it's been unfair for me and I'm just absolutely not.
That's pretty strong.
Yeah. So what do you think about this idea of applying affirmative action?
To relationships.
Yeah, to relationships.
I mean, that's a really complex analogy, I think. And it brings up a lot of ethical questions, like, can you really apply this concept to human connection in that way?
Right. So we've talked about taking offense for others, cultural sensitivity, and this idea of our affirmative action relationships. But there's one more thing that he brings up that I think is really important to discuss.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He brings up Malcolm X.
Oh.
And specifically this quote that Malcolm X said, the black man and black woman's greatest enemy is the white liberal.
Wow.
And it seems like he's drawing a parallel to, people being overly sensitive or taking offense for others.
Right, because Malcolm X was really critical of, those who wanted to appear virtuous, but not really enact change.
Right.
So I wonder if he's suggesting a similar sort of savior complex.
Yeah. Where people feel the need to step in.
Right.
When it's not really needed.
And so it really makes you think about, like, the motivations behind activism.
Absolutely.
Like, is it really to help?
Yeah.
Or are you just trying to make yourself...
Are you centering yourself in this?
Yeah.
Or are you actually trying to amplify marginalized voices?
And then he goes on to talk about how culture changes.
Yeah.
And how what might have been offensive in the past isn't offensive now.
Totally. I mean, think about how much language has evolved.
Yeah.
Even in the last couple of decades.
Right.
Like, words that were once considered taboo are now commonplace.
Totally. And he even uses the example of blackface, which he says, maybe it wouldn't be as offensive today.
That's a really tough one, I think.
Yeah.
Because while some things do evolve, certain practices are just so deeply rooted in racism that they probably will always be offensive.
Right. And he talks about how he used to be a lot more easily offended.
Oh, okay.
But as he's grown and matured, he's not as reactive.
So he's suggesting that maybe some people are just immature or lack perspective.
He has this really interesting analogy about a gym.
Okay.
And he says, when you tell somebody that poor you can't do for yourself, look how terrible everything is for you and your people. Let me do these things for you. It's like you stepping into a gym with me every time. Oh my God.
Yeah.
You're so weak. You're so, just so skinny. You just can't lift anything. And it's, it's just so unfair. Let me lift those weights for you. And now you start to do my workout. You get buff. And I still end up staying the exact same week full of soy.
Wow. That's a very visual analogy.
It is.
I mean, it's definitely memorable. And he's highlighting the importance of personal agency. But it does make you wonder about that line between helping and letting people struggle.
Right. So we've talked about this video creator's perspective on offense and, personal growth and cultural evolution. What are your big takeaways here?
Well, I think this video is definitely challenging us to think about our own reactions and, how we deal with things that we find offensive.
Right.
And to think about personal responsibility as a key part of navigating this world.
It makes you think about, how can we engage with other cultures
in a way that's respectful, but also doesn't shut down all conversation. We don't want to be so afraid of offending that we stop talking to each other. We don't want to be so afraid of offending that we
where's the line?
Right.
And he actually brings up something that I think is really important.
Okay.
Which is this idea of being able to laugh at yourself and not taking everything so seriously.
Yeah.
And he brings up White Chicks again.
Okay.
And he says, it was a very commercially successful movie.
Right.
So
maybe we need to lighten up a little.
Yeah, when is it okay?
Yeah, where's the line?
To make a joke, and when is it not?
And this goes back to that idea of punching up versus punching down.
Right.
Is it okay to make fun of people in power?
Right.
But not okay to make fun of marginalized groups.
So how do we figure out where that line is?
I think it comes down to thinking about the impact of our words and acts.
Right.
Who might be harmed by this joke.
And I think it's also important to consider, what are you trying to do with this joke?
Right. Are you trying to...
You're trying to make a point.
Build connection.
Are you trying to be funny?
Yeah.
Or are you trying to hurt someone?
Or are you trying to... reinforce a stereotype.
Yeah, and he even says that, sometimes when you're offended by something, it's actually something within you.
Oh, that's interesting.
That you're offended by.
Yeah, you're projecting your own insecurities onto this other person or situation.
So I think this has been a really interesting deep dive.
It has.
Into one person's very passionate argument about this very complex topic.
Yeah.
What are your final thoughts?
Well, I think the most important thing is to just be open to listening and learning.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we all have different perspectives and what might be okay for one person is not okay for another.
And to be willing to change your mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If somebody tells you that something is offensive to them, you should listen to them.
Believe them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also important to remember that, like, cultural exchange can be a really good thing.
It can be a beautiful thing when it's done respectfully.
Right. And so I think the key is to find that balance between being sensitive, but also not being so afraid of offending people.
That you shut down all conversation.
That we shut ourselves off from the world.
Exactly.
Well, this has been another really thought-provoking deep dive.
Yeah, it has.
I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.